Over 90% of people in the United States drink caffeine daily in coffee or through something else. But what I highly doubt is that people know that caffeine affects your vision. Some new clinical research has come out looking at in what ways caffeine actually impacts your vision. And today I'm going to break one of those studies down. If you drink caffeine regularly or at all, which should probably be around 90% of you, this is something for you to watch. Let's get into the video. What's up everyone, my name is Henrik and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm breaking down a clinical trial looking at the effects of caffeine consumption on dynamic visual acuity. The study was published in August of 2021 by Dr. Beatríz Redondo and others from the University of Granada in Spain. Today's study specifically looks at dynamic visual acuity. Breaking that down, visual acuity is literally how good you see or how strong your vision is. I'm sure a large majority of people have actually had this tested, with probably a chart that looks like this. This is called a Snellen chart, by the way. But that chart specifically looks at static visual acuity, meaning you're just sitting there, not moving, while looking at something that's not moving. Dynamic visual acuity is looking at something that is moving, or looking at something while you're moving yourself. This is pretty applicable in sports, or while driving, or writing, and things like that. And today's study is the first to look at how caffeine affects dynamic visual acuity. So let's get into the video. Looking to the study design, this was a double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical trial in 21 participants with an average age of 22. The inclusion criteria, or criteria that had to be met when looking for participants, basically required to have little to no eye problems. Although it was a little bit more complex than this, it's not really important for our purposes. All participants were also importantly noted as low caffeine users, or those who drank less than 2 cups of coffee a day. So they have a relatively lower tolerance to caffeine. The participants were either in a caffeine or placebo group and had 2 separate testing days. Basically, the participants took their pill, caffeine or placebo, and neither they or the researchers knew which was which, hence a double-blinded method. The caffeine dosing is obviously important here, and in this case, it was dosed to be 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So the dose was proportional to your weight. In this study, the average body weight was 68.4 kilograms, or around 150 pounds. So the average caffeine dose was 270 milligrams, which is still pretty a lot, and that's around 3 cups of coffee. Other studies have looked at similar doses, but otherwise the researchers didn't specify why they chose 4 milligrams per kilogram. On each of the 2 main testing days, the exact same thing happened. When they arrived, they all took a questionnaire and did the dynamic vision acuity test, or DVA test. Then they took their pill, they waited 60 minutes, and then took the questionnaire and did the DVA test again to see how caffeine could have affected the results. The questionnaire was the Stanford Sleepiness scale, which as you can see here is super basic, and it just assesses how awake you are. The purpose of this is to see how caffeine actually affected your mental state, to verify that caffeine was enough to wake you up. And surprise, surprise, since it was 270 milligrams on average, that's a lot of caffeine for someone who doesn't drink caffeine that often. After the questionnaire, the DVA test was done. This specific test is a newly designed and validated test called the MOV and test, which hasn't been popularized, and really there haven't been other videos on there of what this test actually looks like. From my understanding and from what the description said in the paper, basically there's a capital letter E moving across the screen, and it's in one of 4 orientations. This E moves across the screen in random directions, like left to right, up or down, or diagonally or anything, and moves at different various speeds, like much faster and much slower. And throughout this test, as it's flying across the screen, the subjects have to indicate which orientation of 4 the E is facing. The researchers changed the paths of the E, they changed the direction, they changed how fast it moved, and just collected a bunch of data on how often the participants correctly got the right answer. After this, they took the results of these tests, compared the placebo and caffeine groups to see how they compared and whether the caffeine group actually had better results on the DVA tests. Looking at the results, as you can see here, when looking at the basic level of activation questionnaire, the caffeine sufficiently activated the participants relative to baseline. So in the least, caffeine affected the caffeine group in some way, meaning the dose of caffeine was high enough. Looking at the visual results, there are 2 important figures to look at. First, figure 2 here shows reaction times on making a decision on what orientation the letter E was in. The left figure shows this when the E was moving in a horizontal direction, and the right shows when E was moving in a random direction. The x-axis shows how fast the letter E was moving across the screen, and as we can see, the caffeine group had a faster reaction time when the E was moving horizontally when compared to placebo, but the change on the right wasn't large enough to be statistically significantly different. Looking at the figure 3 here, this actually looks at DVA, basically how often you were correct when saying what orientation the E was in. A and B represent the same thing as in figure 2, where the left is when E was moving in a horizontal direction, the right is when the E was moving in random directions. As you can see, the caffeine group had better visual acuity on both measures, which were both statistically significant. In short, when looking at moving things, the caffeine group could react faster when the E was moving horizontally, and the caffeine group could accurately indicate the orientation of the E, no matter what direction the E was moving in. And most importantly, the caffeine caused these participants to improve on these tests relative to placebo. Okay, so this study found that caffeine increases dynamic visual reaction time and dynamic visual acuity. The reason I think today's study is so interesting, though, is because I think of all the real-life applications that require solid dynamic visual acuity, and caffeine can temporarily boost your ability to see those things. I think the most obvious applications are in sports, like watching a ball come towards you in football or basketball, or swinging at a moving thing, like in tennis, baseball, or hockey. But besides that, there's a lot of other applications, like driving or physically writing things down, and I'm sure you can think of many other things as well. Who knows, maybe even in the eye doctor's office, taking caffeine beforehand could inflate your eye strength to some degree. Although I do know that most of the basic eye tests done are static, and there really aren't studies on the effects of caffeine on static visual acuity just yet. Interestingly, eyes in response to caffeine have been studied in the past, but only under physically fatigued states. So one of the first studies to look at a basic scenario of take caffeine, let's measure your eyes, was actually only done in 2017. The study basically found that the eyes moved faster and had faster reflexes when caffeinated. Another study from 2019 looked at the ability of the eyes to have higher contrast sensitivity, like the ability to find changes between distinct objects. And they found that caffeine actually causes an increase in those changes, or increases your ability to contrast things. Another study from 2019 also found that consuming caffeine caused an increase in your eye's ability to accommodate or adjust to distances, like things moving towards or away from you. This is more useful in driving. Now, the basic explanation of why these things are happening is because caffeine is a central nervous stimulant that has a wide variety of stimulating effects. And one of those effects could have to do with the occipital lobe, or the lobe of your brain that has to do with your eyes or vision. And so that can explain why caffeine could increase dynamic visual acuity as seen today. Something important to note is that today's study only looked at people who consumed less than 2 cups of coffee a day, which is only 25% of total coffee drinkers. And so maybe dynamic visual acuity could be less affected if you already have a high tolerance, or maybe you just need to take a lot more than 4 milligrams per kilogram or 1.8 milligrams per pound. But honestly, that amount of caffeine is already pretty decent. Another thing is that the study only looked at 60 minutes after consuming caffeine. So I wonder how long the effects actually last on vision. Who knows, maybe they only last for 2 hours or the whole day, although this might depend on tolerance and metabolism of the caffeine from person to person. Another comment on this study is that it only looked at one type of dynamic visual acuity test. Technically, DVA is defined as vision when there's relative movement between a target and an observer. In this case, the test only moved the target, but there are many other tests out there that also move the observer as well, while keeping the target still. I think it would greatly strengthen the results to have more tests to support the idea that caffeine improves DVA. I can also link a bunch of YouTube video links to some of these other DVA tests that actually move the person. They look pretty interesting, but they're also a little weird too. But additionally, there was also a small sample size, so there's a lot of variability, and definitely more trials have to be done to support the claim that we saw today. But in my opinion, it's still interesting to see this preliminary result that caffeine can have these positive effects on your vision, and it's something I've personally never thought about before. Honestly, I'm also a little surprised that this stuff hasn't been studied until the past year, given that caffeine has been around for centuries in the least, and the technology to test DVA has also been around for decades, so just another thought. Looking at a brief summary and some takeaways, a 2021 clinical trial found that caffeine increases dynamic visual acuity. Nice and simple. It's the first study to look at caffeine and DVA, and I think it's super interesting that over 90% of people in the United States drink caffeine daily, and they probably don't know that caffeine positively impacts their vision. DVA specifically refers to visualizing moving things or visualizing something while you're moving, and it's really applicable in sports, driving, watching videos, writing, typing, a lot of different applications out there. I guess technically the real application or takeaway here is that if you consume caffeine before doing something athletic or drinking coffee in the morning, besides getting the normal stimulating effects, you can temporarily improve your vision too, and that's helpful for you to know. And in the least, now you have learned something new about how caffeine affects your vision, and you've also learned something about interesting, updated clinical research too. So, very exciting. But that's all I had for today. Don't forget to check out my description for the papers I've used and my sources. And don't forget to check out my channel for other videos on other topics that I've talked about, especially like my first caffeine video, the first video I've ever posted that actually talked about how caffeine negatively impacts your sleep. But thank you for watching, and have a good one.